Good morning, everybody. So this chapter, probably one of the harder ones for me. When I just think about it, I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what to do with the history of the United States and Native Americans, in particular, the focus on the native inhabitants of the U.S. It's sort of like back in the day, there were the conquerors and those who were conquered. Oftentimes they were just killed. They were just obliterated. And so then you didn't have to deal with, well, what do we do with them now? How do we manage population? In a lot of the colonial era, it was just simply they were forced into these colonies where basically they extracted all the resources from their land and then shipped it off to the colonial powers. And so they were exploited in that way. There's really I can't think of any situation where it was the optimal situation for the people who were the native land dwellers. And in fact, you might say that the U.S. is the best example because instead of sort of having these colonial powers, a few colonial powers controlling the masses, you actually had a huge infusion of refugees, of people from England and other parts of Northern Europe coming into the U.S. and sort of they made this their home. But if you look around the world and you see like the hot spots or the places that had the biggest challenges and war and violence and instability, it's places that used to be under colonial rule. So 10, 20 years ago with South Africa and apartheid, all of that was because outsiders came in and really messed up the system. Or if you look at countries like Nigeria or Kenya or India or Pakistan, you know, in a sense, England took, when they were the colonial rule over the area of India, that used to include Pakistan and Bangladesh. But the British decided, well, let's just chop up this area such that the Muslim people go up to Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then the Hindus stay in the region which we'll call India. And if you notice, even over the past 10 years, finally the Indian country is reverting the names of their cities back to the original language. So like when the British came in, they took Mumbai and they said, this is Bombay. They just changed the name. It's no longer Mumbai, it's Bombay. And so if you read in your history books and you see, oh wait, what's this place called Bombay? Or what's Mumbai? Oh, they're the same city, it's just who's naming them. So when I think of the Native Americans in the U.S., I'm stuck. I mean, I read this history, you guys read the history, and it's very perplexing of what do we do with this? To me, it's an example, and it can relate to the workplace on a smaller scale, but it relates in the sense of this systematic exploitation of people who are more vulnerable than you. So it's this idea of exploiting people who are more vulnerable, people who don't have as much power, and thinking or acting as if it's okay, and just sort of moving on. And one interesting thing that a linguist friend of mine had discovered and was researching is the names or attributions we give to people of different cultures. And oftentimes, the words that we'll use are like insects. Like sometimes the Latino community will be referred to as cockroaches, or other people of different communities will be referred to in ways that are subhuman, or like savages of some sort, like something that's just not fully human. And by identifying and characterizing people in this subtly subhuman way, it gives us license to treat them in a subhuman way. I mean, a lot of you reacted to the examples of the slave owner having sex with one of the slaves, and then having a child through that, and then disowning that child and having that child become a slave. Now, you sit there and read that and you're like, how in the world could the slave owner do that? Well, if the slave owner in his mind felt that these people are subhuman, then that sort of puts you down the path of sort of justifying or allowing yourself to treat them in a subhuman way. And so we do this, I would argue, in subtle ways in the workplace or on campus, where we have this hierarchy where some people are like, they're full-blooded American. I mean, I think someone wrote that in the memo of like, well, what is a full-blooded American? Because we were talking about the one-drop rule. Well, so we have these characteristics of, well, this is a full-blooded part of the team. But then these other people, they're kind of on the margins. They're just different. They're not like us, and so then they get treated differently. So I guess when we reflect on the Native American history and our history with them, a part of it is just thinking, is this played out, is this repeated on campus, but in very subtle, nuanced ways? Like, so we don't go around with guns and killing people, but do we exploit or subtly take advantage of those who are more vulnerable than us, or those who we subtly sort of view as being subhuman or not full-blooded, not fully a part of the system? I have a video that gives more detail of the very beginning. One of you asked if the population of Native Americans in the 1600s was 8 million, by basic population growth standards, they should be the most populous people in the U.S. Like their population level should be off the chart. If they started with 8 million, because you think of the early settlers, they were very few in number. So what happened? Well, this gives a picture of what actually happened.
The first successful colony in America was established in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia, by English settlers. But these first Europeans arrived in a land that was already home to other people, to indigenous Native Americans who thousands of years before had crossed over a land bridge from Siberia into what's now the state of Alaska. They were the first explorers of this beautiful land, and they would spread throughout the entire continent and throughout Central and Southern America too. Native Americans thrived by harnessing the power of nature, and over time, they formed into many distinct groups, each with their own languages and cultures. Then, in 1492, as legend has it, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and arrived in the Bahamas, and immediately encountered a group of these indigenous people called the Arawak. The Arawak were curious and friendly, but Columbus was filled with greed, and took some of them prisoner, demanding they show him where the gold they were wearing came from. Now, the Native Americans were so easygoing and poorly armed compared to these Europeans, who had modern weaponry like metal-forged swords and armor and even guns, that Columbus said, quote, "I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I pleased." And that's exactly what he and other Spanish conquistadors who came after him did. They vanquished indigenous group after indigenous group with cunning and sheer brutality, and got a lot of help from diseases like smallpox that moved ahead of them and just wiped the natives out.
Once smallpox was taken to the New World, nobody in the New World had ever seen a disease like this before, so the number of people who were susceptible was much greater. There was no natural immunity, and so therefore the number of people who could both contract the disease and then spread it, and the number of people to receive it once it had been spread was much higher.
Some scholars think there may have been a population of 20 million Native Americans, and the vast majority, perhaps 95%, were killed by Old World diseases. A continent virtually emptied of its people.
It's a combination of disease, which is a very interesting epidemiological fact, but also it wasn't just disease, it was conquest. There's land that we want, that you have, and we have greater power than you, and so we want to take this land. So then once they're there, and once we're sort of trying to coexist, that wasn't enough. There was ongoing tensions, basically competition. And it's the same story that we've heard about immigrants, or waves of immigrants coming in. It's all about sort of labor and work and profit and property. And over a certain period, as agriculture in the South was growing, the Southerners wanted more land, but it was land that was occupied by Native Americans. Or not occupied, is where they lived. It was their home. But the Southern farmers wanted that property, and so they pushed the U.S. government to take action. And a lot of you read about the Indian Removal Act, and it's basically, I mean, again, it's this scenario of think about your home that you grew up in, and think about your neighborhood, and even your high school that you went to. If the U.S. government came in one day and said, okay, new plan, all of you that are here right now, you're going to need to move. And we've picked this wonderful place for you. It's the most sought after place that everyone wants to go to, that no one lives in right now, but you'll really like it. And so we're going to pick you up and move you, the entire community. And it's just unfathomable. You would just say, no, you can't do that. But then again, it's this idea of exploiting the vulnerable. And that's what the Indian Removal Act was. And it was merciless in the sense that it was the Trail of Tears, and that over 1,000 miles these people just walked. I don't know how many days or months it took, but it was basically, you're no longer allowed to be here. And if you refuse, you're going to be killed. So your only option is to start walking. Pack your stuff and start walking. And that's a lot of what the Trail of Tears was, and this gives a sense of the magnitude of that.
Jackson was determined to change Washington and America, and he did so with lightning speed.
The first major piece of legislation that he recommended and got passed was the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
This act empowered Jackson to forcibly evict all the Indian tribes living east of the Mississippi River. 5 Indian nations were directly affected. Of the 5, the Cherokee tribe, located in Georgia, chose to fight the eviction in a surprising way.
Instead of going on the warpath the way their fathers and grandfathers might have done, this generation of Cherokee Indians took Georgia to court.
The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In an historic decision, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of the Cherokee, saying they did not have to move. But Andrew Jackson thought differently.
Jackson said of Marshall, he made his ruling, let him enforce it. Now let him enforce it.
The result was that they were rounded up at gunpoint and forced to move. The property was seized, and they were forced west. Of course, on the Cherokees' forced march, one out of every 4 Cherokees died en route, which is why they call it the Trail of Tears.
It is, without a doubt, the most controversial decision Jackson would make in his career. And is one of the saddest chapters in American history.
It strikes me that even though the Supreme Court, in a sense, the Cherokees were saying, okay, we're in the land of the United States, and they operate through a judicial system, and so we are going to play by the rules, and we're going to appeal to the highest court of the land and sort of make a case for why this is unjust. And so they followed the rules, and the court even ruled in their favor, and still the government, or more the U.S. people, decided to turn a blind eye to that and push forward with the plan. And it baffles me, one, that you really don't learn about these things. They're sort of silent about it in history classes, but then once you become aware of it, it's like, well, so what do we do? Like, how do we make sense of that? Does anyone have a $20 bill? Does anyone have a $20 bill on them? Can you pull it out? Or whoever has one, pull it out so other people can see it.
Is Jackson on it?
What did you say?
Is Jackson on it?
Who's on it?
Is it Andrew Jackson?
I don't know. What does it say? Apart from the $1 bill, the $20 bill is the most popular bill. And if you're aspiring to be on a bill or a coin, if you make it to the $20 bill, you're doing very good. Can someone pull out a gold dollar coin? Someone have a gold dollar coin? Actually, the one that I'm talking about is out of print, but you still might have it. It's the one with Saskatchewan and her baby, the Native American. No one has that. No, you should have like tons of them in your pocket. Part of my point is, in this period of history, who do we glorify and esteem? And yes, there is a Native American on the coin. The coin is out of circulation, or it's no longer being printed. But to me, that's a good picture of even not only being blind to it, but even esteeming and glorifying someone who was the leader of this type of atrocity. So then the U.S. is in this perplexed state, like late 1800s, early 1900s. They're sort of beginning to realize, okay, what these Native Americans didn't go away. We kind of were just hoping that they would go away. that they would die off, or, it's like when you make a mistake and you have this vain imagination that, like, well, if it just disappears, then I don't have to deal with it. Like, let's just get rid of it. But it doesn't go away. Most mistakes that we make continue to haunt us until they're addressed. And so the U.S. is beginning to take these different approaches to sort of remedy the situation. And one of the things that you guys mentioned and heard about was the American schools for Native Americans, where they basically, it wasn't just giving them a free public education, but it took them out of their homes, away from their communities, and said, okay, we're going to do, brainwashing's too strong of a word, but it's this sort of realignment of their value system, and basically make them into full-blooded Americans. Take them out of their savage culture and make them into true Americans. One of it was just stripping away and minimizing and devaluing all of their values and all of their history and all of their culture, their language, and then saying, here's a better one. But doing it in a way that was totally stripped from their home community, from their families. And now this is an extreme comparison, but I think it relates. So you remember the person in Cleveland who had kidnapped the two women, and held them hostage for years, and actually had a child with one of the women. And so in his house he held them hostage, and there's a small girl in there. And what I found basically these women couldn't leave. I mean, they were held hostage for years upon years upon years. They had a child. The child was born in that house. And so as the child's growing up, the kidnapper, what he did was he would go get children's books and give them to the little girl to sort of educate her, or let her get a type of education. And it's sort of like, okay, wow, that's really nice and kind of you, but you're ignoring the fact that you're holding these people captive and you're their kidnapper. And so, in a sense, you're never really addressing the root problem, the original violation. And so, same with the Native Americans, a lot of the sort of reparations that are ways that we try to remedy the situation are Band-Aids. It's sort of like, okay, well, let's sort of make this not look as bad as it seems. Let's sort of prop it up, and yet never really dealing with the original violation. And now, so much time has gone on, it's like, how do you change, how do you remedy that original violation? It's just like those two women and their child who was kidnapped. Their lives are irreparably harmed. They can possibly move on from that, but so much has been taken from them that how do you even begin to address the original violation? But that's a sense of what the American schools were. They were attempts to sort of prop this up, but never really giving them full freedom and license to sort of to live out freely in their own land. And same with the Indian Citizen Act. Again, these are sort of like attempts to sort of prop up or sort of fix the problems. And there's been a movement amongst Native Americans coincides with the civil rights movement, and I think you'll see this. Like a lot of times when we talk about the civil rights era, we think about it as black empowerment, but it also, the African Americans sort of led the way for other minority groups and other marginalized groups to have a voice. And so what the civil rights era accomplished was significant for African Americans, but it also gave voice to other communities. And in fact, some of the most powerful moments in the civil rights era is when the different ethnic groups and ethnic minorities worked together to sort of fight for equal rights amongst all people. Not just, well, let me just argue for the rights of my community, but recognizing, okay, all communities deserve these rights. And a fascinating thing happened in San Francisco. There's Alcatraz Island, which is the prison, the infamous prison that's in the middle of San Francisco Bay. And that actually was a special land for the Native Americans. But then when the U.S. took over, they sort of said, well, this is our property, and we're going to put a prison there. But then they abandoned that prison, and so it created this unique legal space for the Native Americans to have a right to that land. And so they took over, they went and occupied that land and said, okay, this piece of rock, this island is now ours. But it is also symbolic of a lot of this land is ours and it was taken from us. And so this was a movement that happened just one generation ago of Native Americans advocating for their rights and for their liberties.
America in the 1960s was full of counterculture movements looking to revolutionize politics and popular culture. Ignited by protests against America's involvement in the Vietnam War, activist groups emerged advocating for civil, women's, and gay rights. Amidst this backdrop, the Red Power movement of the American Indian was born. Catalyzed by the revolutionary 1969 occupation of Alcatraz, the Red Power movement would play a powerful role in forcing reform of U.S. government policy towards Indians. During the 1950s, government relocation and termination policies encouraged Indian movement away from reservations and into cities. The goal was to force Indians to integrate into mainstream society, but led to the destruction of their tribes, beliefs, and cultures. The government's promises of adequate housing, job counseling, and social services were often unfulfilled. Many Indians lived in poor conditions with high rates of alcoholism and unemployment. Indians scattered throughout the country were demoralized with little hope for a better future. In 1968, Alcatraz Island, an abandoned prison in the San Francisco Bay, was declared surplus property by the U.S. government. The United Council sought to buy the island, citing the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, which stated that all retired, abandoned, and out-of-use federal lands belonged to the Indians. When the San Francisco Indian Center was mysteriously destroyed in a fire, the angered United Council suspected arson by anti-Indian groups. This instigating event led the council to decisive action. They began preparations for an Indian occupation of Alcatraz in hopes of bringing national attention to the cause for Indian self-determination. After a year of planning and 2 failed attempts, on the morning of November 20th, 1969, 79 Indians disembarked at Alcatraz Island. This marked the beginning of a 19-month occupation that would captivate the nation and culminate in significant reform in U.S. government policy towards Indians. After more than 7 months of occupation, they achieved their first significant victory when on July 8, 1970, President Nixon proposed a new policy of self-determination without termination for Indians. The revolutionary 1969 Indian occupation of Alcatraz catapulted the issue of Indians' rights to the forefront of the national consciousness and stimulated extraordinary reactions from the federal government and the American people. Substantial reform was achieved, and the lives of Indians were changed forever.
A lot of times on campus, there'll be different groups advocating for certain rights, and actually not just advocating, but they have this agitational strategy where they agitate, where they shake up the system, they disrupt what's going on in the community. And I know a lot of times for me when I am on campus and maybe I can't get through because there's people protesting or blocking something or having some type of sit-in or demonstration, I'm kind of like, well, let's just move on. Like what's the big deal? But oftentimes that's from a posture, from a position of privilege. It's like, I don't need to agitate. Things are fine for me, but if you look specifically within Native Americans, the number of treaties that the U.S. government signed with the Native Americans, I mean, it's almost a mockery. It's almost as if they knew every time that they were signing it that they had no intention of fulfilling it. I mean, I can't. The list is in the hundreds of the treaties where they said, okay, let's come to an agreement here. And it's all spelled out right here. Here's what we're going to commit to you, just as long as you guys leave or move. And then we'll give you these things, but just as long as you move. Can you just let's get the process going and get you moved out, so that and then we can move on. And I spent a summer up in Alaska, and one of the things I did was went up to one of the Native American villages up in Alaska. And I go up there, and basically you could only fly in because there's no roads, and we land there. And what struck me was a lot of people had four-wheelers, and I thought, wow, that's kind of cool. I mean, they were like nice ones, and they were flying all over the village and driving around. And the other thing though that struck me was the incredible poverty of the people, just the living conditions of the people. And then the other thing that stood out to me was the alcoholism, like the rampant alcoholism. And it was just very, like, it was, the way I described it, it was like, picture yourself when you're in high school, and picture your neighborhood in high school. And let's say all of a sudden, all the parents left, but they left all their credit cards to all the high school kids, and basically said, go do whatever you want. And that's, in a sense, what played out in this village and a lot of villages. Back in the 70s, the oil companies discovered oil up in Alaska. But a lot of it was on the land of these Native Americans. And so they came in and said, we'll give you $1 million. We'll give your entire community $1 million if we can have the rights to the oil that's on your land. They didn't tell them that oil was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but they came in saying, we'll give you $1 million. And so the Native Americans accepted that offer. Now you could say, well, that was a fair deal, or you could say that was exploiting the vulnerable people. And also, when you give someone a large sum of money, imagine again yourself in high school and you're just handed a large sum of money, and you're like, hey, go do whatever you want, and you might have this mindset that it's just going to be a continuous flow of money. You just go and spend and spend and spend, and then when it runs out, you're kind of like, oh, isn't there more money? And it's like, no, it's gone. It's done. And so if you didn't sort of have a master plan for sort of building the infrastructure, building schools, building industry, to sort of reinvest that money in effective ways, you're going to have the situation that occurred with the Native Americans. And I would say, some could take a posture of, well, they chose their own destiny. But we could also say that they were exploited and taken advantage of and not set up to succeed. It was more set up to get out of the way. It was sort of, there was no real care or concern. So when we pull this back to managing diversity, a lot of it is what is our posture towards different communities. One of the things that I just found out over the weekend is SPIA wants to become more diverse in its student population amongst undergrads, master's students, and PhD students. And so I was talking with an African American master's student and talking about how do they, what's recruiting of African American students into SPIA like. And he said that he went to an HBCU, a historically black college and university, and he said he didn't even know about SPIA. There was no recruiters that came to his school to tell him about SPIA and how you could get a master's in public administration. And when he got here, he ended up talking to the SPIA recruiters, and they don't go to any HBCU colleges. And yet 70% of African Americans, I think that's the number, that are in college are in HBCU universities. There's over 100 HBCU colleges and universities in the U.S. And so here's Indiana genuinely wanting to increase its diversity, and yet when they're going to recruit potential students, it's not part of their strategic plan to go to HBCUs. Whereas if you go to just even a few of them, you open yourself up to a huge population of students of color who might very well like to come here. I mean, this student was very hesitant to come here because he's like, I never heard of it. he was looking at schools in New York or in Chicago where it was just more known and more accessible. But here you have a place, Indiana, which is struggling to increase its diversity, and yet it's not just, we're sitting here saying, well, why don't they come? Why don't they come? But part of it is what is the recruiting strategy? And it'd be the same for a business. The same would be for Native Americans. If you want to increase the population of Native Americans in your school or at your workplace, are you going to the schools and institutions on the reservations? Probably not, because they're far away. They're in removed, out-of-the-way places. I mean, if you look at where the current Native American reservations are, they're some of the least desirable places that you would ever want to live. I mean, we did not give them prime real estate. We gave them the stuff that we didn't want, the abandoned places that were never going to be developed. And so we just said, you can go here. But a part of this idea of increasing diversity goes on where are you doing your recruiting? What are the pools of people that you're recruiting from? But again, you still have to answer the question, do you want to increase diversity? And how important is it? Because it costs money. I mean, part of the thing with SPEA going to HBCU colleges or not going is, one, they didn't have connections. They didn't have any, so like if someone at SPEA comes to me and says, hey, we want to recruit people from Duke, do you know anyone there? I can give them a whole list of names and say, well, here's all the people you'd want to talk to. In fact, here's the hotel you want to stay at when you go there, and you've got to check out this restaurant. Like, there's just these ties and connections. But if your current population of employees or faculty don't have any ties to these other communities, it creates this barrier to actually then getting there. So part of SPEA's recruiting challenge is we don't know anyone at the HBCU colleges and universities. So then it's just sort of this perpetuating thing. And the same would be within your business if you're predominantly white and you're like, well, we just don't know people from other, we don't have significant relationships with people from different communities. So part of it is developing a strategy for that. I think going back to Native Americans and sort of what the potential benefits and contributions that they would have, especially to a university, but also to different industries, could be phenomenal. And yet we don't see Native Americans. We don't see the breadth and diversity. We have this very narrow caricature of what an Indian is. I mean, a lot of you mentioned cowboys and Indians. That's about the scope and the limit of our understanding of Native Americans. And yet, within the Native American population, there is incredible diversity. And it's just like when we say Asian, that encompasses a wide swath of different ethnicities and countries of origin. The same is true for Native Americans. There isn't just, there's this Native American, but there's all the different tribes and heritages that go back. And this is an interesting video I'm going to show you. It was actually slotted, ironically, to be a commercial during the Super Bowl because of all the different controversies. It never was shown, but it's gone viral online. And to me, it just sort of opens my eyes up to the diversity and sort of the current state of Native Americans in the U.S.
Proud, forgotten, Indian, Navajo, Blackfoot, Inuit, and Sioux, survivor, spiritualist, patriot, Sitting Bull, Hiawatha, and Jim Thorpe. Mother, father, son, daughter, chief. Apache, Pueblo, Choctaw, Chippewa, and Crow. Underserved, struggling, resilient. Squanto, Red Cloud, Tecumseh, and Crazy Horse. Rancher, teacher, Rogers, Geronimo. Unyielding, strong, indomitable. Native Americans call themselves many things. The one thing they don't.
You know, this is a big ongoing. It's a controversy that keeps sort of popping up. Is the idea of mascots? In many ways, I'm kind of just agnostic. I don't know. I don't care. You know, it's just it doesn't matter because it doesn't affect me. You know, and I sit there and I think. I was trying to think how this could relate to us, and I was thinking, let's, you know, we have a midterm coming up. And what if I found the person who got the lowest grade on the midterm, got a D minus, let's say, and I created a bobblehead of that person, spitting image of that person. Let's say it was David. Got a bobblehead of David. And David, the bobblehead of David, I was going to set it right here every day, because this is going to be the reminder, the rally cry of, let's do better. Come on, let's not be David. Let's move on. Let's go. You know, and just sort of every day I put that bobblehead there. And some days I just sort of left it there and didn't talk about it. But it's just the little bobblehead of David. Because David was sort of our mascot, our inspiration to do better. And, you know, it'd be funny and it'd be kind of a little bit awkward. But it'd be funny because sometimes I'd be like, come on, don't be David. And I'd shake it so that his head would bobble and people would laugh. But imagine what the experience would be for David. This caricature of him that is not representative of who you are. It takes one sort of incident or one picture of you, but then makes that the master picture, the only identity. You would be known forever in this class as, oh yeah, David, the bobblehead guy, he's the one who cut the D on the midterm. Wasn't that so funny? Because when you look at the Redskin, so it's a caricature that most Native Americans would say, yes, that might have been part of our history, but it isn't all of our history, and it isn't who we are today. It is not. That is not how we act and dress and look today, and yet we're being frozen in time. And this image and this impression is just being reinforced such that it becomes harder and harder and harder to break out of that. Like, so if David goes and gets his first job, I would go to his boss and say, hey, whoa, whoa, you know, make sure you keep the bobblehead. This thing is great. Everyone in the company will love it. I mean, it's just so much fun. And David gets a kick out of it. He loves it. It's so endearing. It's so cute. You know, it's just sort of, like, it's like, give me a break. Get off my back. Like, let me be. Stop pigeonholing me in being a certain way. So regardless of where you stand on the mascot issue, my sense, and someone asked this in the memos, is to ask a Native American or to read up on a Native American perspective on how they feel about it. Because they're the ones who are being exploited and being pigeonholed in a certain way. And so when the textbook talks about investigating, I think they brought it up for this chapter in particular because we don't have much exposure. And so then we make sort of decisions and move forward with our ignorant understanding. One thing that stands out when we talk about mascots was, you know, thinking about the state that we live in. We live in Indiana. Indiana. The origins of the state that we live in, the reason why Indiana is called Indiana, what Indiana means, is the land of Indians. This area, which is now called Indiana, was teeming with Native Americans. I mean, that's why, you know, they came, the explorers who came here, the way they described this land compared to all the other lands was, wow, this is heavily, heavily, heavily populated with Native Americans, with Indians. So there's something unique about Indiana, because they didn't name Ohio the land of Indians. They didn't name Michigan or Illinois the land of Indians, but this particular state was named the land of Indians. The number of Indians, Native Americans now living in Indiana, is 50,000. And there's currently over 6 million people in Indiana. So less than 1% of the people in the land of Indians are Indians. What happened over time, we were very efficient at removing the Indians from the land of Indians. And these are all the treaties that were established basically to move them out, to get rid of them. Such that now there's only 50,000 Native Americans living in Indiana. When we talk about advantage and privilege, if you are from Indiana, or the fact that you are at IU, there's a good argument that you are benefiting at the expense of Native Americans because of taking over their land. A lot of you say, well, gosh, what would it be like to lose, the question was, I can sort of understand why they have lower income levels and lower education levels because at one point, all of their resources were stripped away, whereas in my family, I have multiple generations of resources and assets building up so that I can then today be at IU and be somewhat comfortable at IU. But if all those resources were taken away, then I'd be at a significant disadvantage. In this dynamic here, some of the groups are benefiting at the expense of the Native Americans. And it strikes me that what it's like in Indiana, just given that the history of Indiana being the land of Indians, now they're less than 0.5% of the population. And so when we think about managing diversity, it strikes me, this class, how profoundly different this class could be if it was taught by a Native American. I guarantee you, your learning experience would be better. To have a voice from a marginalized community teach this class, because my scope and understanding is limited by my experience. There's things that I can learn, but it isn't until we do exercises like the privilege game that you really it begins to sink in. But if someone is living this, I guarantee you they're a much more effective educator than someone who's just an academic and has the head knowledge of it. And so when you think of organizations and why would you benefit from having diversity, part of it is a class like this. I think it would benefit from having people of color or people from marginalized communities teach a class like this. Or if you're in an organization and you're thinking about how can we approach a new market or a new industry in a way that isn't exploitative, like if that's a genuine value of your organization, having someone like a Native American, if Chevron hired a Native American or hired multiple Native Americans, I believe it would change the way they do business. It might not make them more profitable, but it would change the way they do business and how they make transactions and deals. Again, I'm not making the argument that having increased diversity will get you more profits. I don't think I can't make a strong claim on that. It won't necessarily. But I think it'll make you a better organization, a better person, a better company within the community.